whether the US and Russia were and perhaps still are necessary rivals. So please join me in welcoming Ivan Kurilla to our series. And again, I think this is a great way to conclude. This will be our last talk, as I mentioned, of the semester. We hope to continue in the fall by continuing to look at Cold War legacies, but I think this talk today, which brings together both a Russian perspective and a US perspective on the Cold War, will be a great way to end things. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Ivan.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for organizing, for inviting me to this series, and thanks everybody on the other side of this Zoom connection. Good afternoon, good evening, and yes, let me start with. I will start with some discussion of the Cold War. Everybody understands that the Cold War included the arms race, and arms race was one of the key features of the period of Soviet-American rivalry, and that was an important part of the scholarly discussion about the Cold War. But we also know by now, and we understand it better by now, that that was not the only sphere of the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. The arms race was not the only sphere where America and Soviet Union, or as we called that, at our country was called that, developed the rivalry. That was also the important, several other important spheres where Soviet Union and the United States developed the rivalry, and and I would say that that was a rivalry for the hearts and minds of the humankind, and each country should produce the best image of their own achievement, of their own way of life, to be attractive for newly independent countries that just were emerging out of the collapsing empires of British Empire, French Empire in the late 40s, during the 50s and early 60s. And that was all the time of the Cold War, and also at the time of appearance of the new countries, new states in Africa, in South Asia. And that was an important spatial dimension of the Cold War. Who will be the most attractive ally and the model for those countries which were just liberated themselves from European domination. So Russia and Soviet Union at that time and the United States represented different ways of different models for the development, but each country at that time considered itself as a beacon or model for the rest of the humankind. And the Soviet Union offered the idea of the social justice, the communist system in its propaganda form, or at least the ideal form was an idea of social justice for everybody without the negative side of the capitalist economic order. And that was an important sphere of the competition. Which country will be more attractive? And when we, now we looking back on the Cold War, we see that both countries were very much aware of this option, of this dimension of the Russian, of Soviet American competition, and they applied large, forceful efforts to look better, and not just to look better, but they also tried to improve some of the real the features that country could be judged upon, can improve their own societies and improve their own states in order to be better, to be more attractive. And that is why a very important part of the Russian-American rivalry was this attempts to improve their each of the countries in this competition. And that wasn't, that's spheres where the competition was important included such spheres as science, and the space race was an integral part of the Soviet American competitions starting in the late 50s and continued till the 70s at least, or maybe till the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Arts was also another important part of the competition, or at least different approach to what the arts, visual arts, was about.
Okay, please just bear with us for 1 minute. Professor Kurilla, as I mentioned, is joining us from St. Petersburg and has had a difficult internet connection, so he should be rejoining just in 1 minute. Ivan, can you hear us?
Considered itself as a beacon of the humankind, for model for the true development, but also because both Soviet Union and the United States were modern societies with its reliance on the science, on the engineering, on the both struggled for some kind of social justice, well, in a different ways, but still that was an important hierarchy of the values, which to some extent coincided, and both countries were similar. So they competed within those spheres which both countries considered important. Again, in the sphere of science, in the sphere of arts, in the sphere of social justice, of providing social equality. Simultaneously, at the same time, the United States and the Soviet Union tried to export all the bad features of their own societies. Export, I mean, both countries, in both countries, everything which was considered to be alien, considered to be threatening the social order or political order, was portrayed as an alien, as coming from another country, from the rival country. And we know that in the United States, in the late 60s, during the 60s, so maybe starting in the 50s and up to the 70s, one fake document under the title "Communist Rules of the Communist Revolution" widely circulated among conservative politicians, including some congressmen. You can find the copy of this document even in the congressional records in the United States. And that was a document which blamed everything bad in the United States on the communist propaganda or communist interference, communist meddling. It included the spread of the drugs among the youth. It blamed the spread of drugs and the communist interference. It describes the rise of the homosexual part of the society also as a part of the communist interference. And it also describes the fight to limit arms, the limit the handguns access in the United States, possibility to freely buy the handguns, also to the communist interference. So the American conservatives wanted or tried to describe everything they did not like to the communist interference. In the Soviet Union or later in Russia, the very similar document was, created by Soviet conservatives or Russian conservatives. They called it the plan of Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles used to be the head of CIA in the early period of Cold War. And Russian conservatives, many of Russian conservatives believes that everything bad which happened to the Soviet Union was planned and planned by Allen Dulles. And it included also the spread of drugs among Soviet youth. It included the spread of the alien ideology like democracy and liberal values among Soviets. And it included also the plans to destroy the integrity of the Soviet people. So all of those those two fake documents, just an illustration of the wider trend of export everything that the conservatives in each country did not like and to ascribe it to the foreign interference. In the Soviet time, this foreign interference was an American interference. In American, society, the Soviet Union was a major foreign country which interfered into American life, trying to make it more liberal, less conservative, or more, spoiled in terms of the conservatives. So that was also the part of the Soviet-American exchanges, I would say, image exchanges during the Cold War. And I would just add several examples of the competition for better, competition between the Russia and the Soviet Union, which influenced the domestic reforms in two countries. Well, one of the best known is the story of the space race, and I've mentioned already this this important part of the Cold War. And you know that after the Sputnik, after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in 1957, that actually produced a huge impression on the American public. And not only because it was a military threat, certainly it was part of the problem, but it also because it demonstrated that the Soviet Union looked like more advanced in the science. The major rival looked like a country which achieved some scientific horizons earlier than the United States did. And that was a big blow on the American pride because, well, Americans tended to think that, well, probably justly tended to think that Americans are the leading society of inventors, of engineers, and why the Soviet Union was the first. So one of the consequences, one of the direct results of the Soviet launch of the Sputnik was a big reforms in American educational system. You know, in 1959, there was a famous, among historians, among the educators, famous conference in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. That was a conference which actually debated how to reform American education in order to, to not to lose the scientific race to the Soviet Union. And that was a Woods Hole conference which produced recommendations to change the curriculum in the high schools, in college, even in colleges of the United States. And actually it was a, the conference marked the beginning of the new trend in the educational planning. It was the first time when the distinguished people in various fields started to address the general improvement of education and address themselves to this general improvement of education. That was a so-called textbook reform at that point. So everything that we now know as STEM is a longer consequence of those ideas that American children needs to study more math. And that was actually the beginning of so-called new math, new approach to education and mathematics. So that was one of the direct results of the space race on the American education, American curriculum. Well, I mentioned arts. It would be strange, you know, that arts is something which is not a matter of, the field of competition. It does not look like a field of competition. And we know that the the first, easiness, we first saw in the Cold War, started with so-called Lacey-Zarubin agreement, which actually permitted the arts exchange, and artists from two countries started to travel to demonstrate to another country their skills, like Bolshoi theater, Bolshoi ballet, or Moiseyev dance company, which traveled from Russia to the United States. And so it was American artists who came to Russia, and Van Cliburn, who won the Grand Prix of the Moscow symphonic music competition. So that was a big exchange and did not look like a rivalry, but at the same time, there was an interesting dimension in those exchanges, and it was about the contemporary art. There were several books written recently about the role that the American state, and even American secret services like CIA, played in the proliferation or promoting American contemporary art worldwide. That was a time when, in the 50s, it started in the late 40s, but especially in the 50s, when actually, as people now claim, I can tell you the titles of the articles, that it looked like the American government secretly, not in public, funded the international exhibitions of American abstract art. Sidney Pollack, people like who just several years before that were not recognized people, without possibilities, without approach to the wider public, suddenly got a huge funding for international exhibitions that traveled abroad, traveled around the globe. And there were publications that said that was an American government behind this funding. And there is people who were engaged in those organization of those exhibitions say that, I can quote Thomas Braden, who used to serve as a Museum of Modern Art executive secretary in the late 40s, and then joined the CIA in the 50s. And he supervised its cultural activities of CIA. And CIA had cultural activities, which now sounds strange, but it was part of the initial mandate, I would say, of the organization. So he noted in an article published in Saturday Evening Post once, "I am glad that CIA," the title of the article was, "I am glad that CIA was immortal." And he claimed that the American art won more acclaim for the United States than John Foster Dulles or Dwight Eisenhower could have brought with his hundreds of speeches. And the idea why the contemporary art should be supported and should be put into direct competition with a Russian Soviet approach to arts was that the Soviet approach to visual arts was very conservative. It was like a neoclassics, not neo-modern visual arts, which looked very outdated by that time, and it was very much controlled by the state. And the idea was that the abstract expressionism was a demonstration of the concept of individual freedom. That was widely understood as an expression of the that the American society is so free that it can support anything that will look strange or weird from the very beginning. And that was a major idea. And it actually worked even in the competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. That it was an infamous story about Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader of the 60s, Nikita Khrushchev, who personally attacked the Soviet artists who tried to develop the contemporary art, and that was so-called bulldozer exhibition, when they organized the exhibition somewhere in Moscow, and Khrushchev actually visited it and forced bulldozers to destroy the exhibition. And that was a visual difference between the American and Soviet approach to the arts. And that was a visual image that the American arts is free, while the Soviet arts is unfree. And that was, well, it was a strange sphere of the competition, but it also worked. And I would, my third and probably the last example of the Cold War competition in the not usually widely discussed sphere was a competition in the sphere of civil rights or human rights, or how the civil rights movement was influenced by the Cold War. Well, now I can quote the book by Mary Dudziak, the Cold War Civil Rights. The title of the book is Cold War Civil Rights, Race and the Image of American Democracy. And the idea of the author of that book was that the very existence of segregation in the American South, of the racial segregation in the American South, was a very bad spot on the American image, especially in the newly independent African countries. So if the United States could not provide equality for American blacks, how it could be influential, how it could be attractive for African countries, which would just became independent. And that was an important factor for American government, including the American Supreme Court, in pushing for the start of the civil rights. And Mary Dudziak even claimed that even the Supreme Court, famous case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, well, not far from where you now, I think, in Kansas. So that was a story behind this decision, was connected to the attempt to improve American image worldwide, and that was an important part of the competition between important part of the competition, and important part when the Cold War actually influenced the American domestic policies. Well, I would also say that the Soviet Union also wanted to look better than it was, and the American criticism of the Soviet Union actually pushed the Soviet Union to change some policies. And the most important, example was probably the easiness of the immigration of Soviet Jews in the 70s. Nobody could immigrate from the Stalin Soviet Union. And actually nobody could immigrate even from Khrushchev Soviet Union. But under Brezhnev, starting with the detente period, starting with his agreements with Richard Nixon, the Soviet Union started to open, well, half open, partially open its borders, and let Soviet Jews, not everybody from the Soviet Union, but Soviet Jews to emigrate officially to Israel, but in fact, a very big portion of those Soviet Jews emigrated to the United States, some to Europe also. But that was an important change of the Soviet policy, of the traditional Soviet policy, in order to look better, to improve its international image. And the last example of how this vice versa, how the domestic concerns influenced the Cold War, was a story of end of the detente in the late 70s. Jimmy Carter and his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, they actually played an important role in stopping the detente and stopping this period of Soviet American rapprochement. And well, usually, if you look just at history textbook, you would see that the main explanation was that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, or Soviet Union sent troops to Afghanistan, and that was the end of the detente. That was true, but it was partial true, because the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979. By that time, Jimmy Carter was the president since 1977. Well, he was elected in 76. So it was already 3 years in White House. And the detente was actually dead by the Afghanistan, by the start of Soviet Afghanistan invasion. And the main problem was that, the main change was that Jimmy Carter, the major political task was to revive American confidence, American self-confidence. You can imagine, okay, I think that most of the people who now attended this lecture are relatively younger people and do not remember the 70s. But I would remind you that in the middle of the 70s, American society faced several huge drawbacks or challenges. And that within a very short period of time, the Americans actually lost the war in Vietnam, lost an economic stability because of the, well, Arabic countries, petroleum exporter countries raised the oil price like 4 times within a short period of time, and the American economy almost collapsed because of that. And Americans experienced Watergate, and the President Nixon needed to resign because of the imminent impeachment, loss of impeachment. So Americans who usually tend to be proud of their country because the United States was the economically leading country in the world leading economy, because the United States had the strongest, the mightiest military, and because the United States had the best political system in the world, had a severe strike on all 3 sources of American pride. The mighty military lost in Vietnam, the mighty economy lost because of the OPEC sanctions against the United States, and the best political system ended up with the Nixon Watergate scandal. So that was a big blow, actually, eventually. And Carter tried to to heal, to find the medicine to provide the healing for this ones. And so he needed to revive American confidence, American pride. And just imagine yourself being Jimmy Carter in the White House in 1977. Look around, what can you be proud of if you're American president and you're from part of American society? And I have an answer, I have a response. Well, as a historian, I can look back. And the response will be the results of the civil rights movement. You know, the United States by the early 70s finally got rid of the segregation. The United States overcame the legal segregation of the African Americans, and actually it was a huge success. You know, just the country which like 15 years earlier had an official segregation in the number of states, by the middle 70s could be proud that there is no more. And that was an important victory for American society and for American state. So Brzezinski advised, and we now know because all of these White House tapes are now published, or at least available in archives. And well, David Foglesong found it in the archives. That was a direct Brzezinski advice to Jimmy Carter. Let's project, let's turn the agenda of the civil rights into American-Soviet relations. And that was actually what Carter did. Carter started to press the Soviet Union for the human rights issues. He started to press Soviet Union for Soviet Union being not friendly to the human rights. this is something that the United States could not, the question which Americans did not raise during like Eisenhower era, because it was easily be, you know, what aboutism worked very well at that point. Okay, if the United States would criticize Khrushchev Soviet Union for the human rights violation, the response would be easy. Well, you have segregation in the South, how you should criticize us? But now in the 70s, it was easier. It was, you know, the United States won the upper ground in this sphere. And that's why Carter decided to press on that. Well, one of the results was that the detente fell. Well, there is no more meetings between Brezhnev and Carter, and no more agreements signed at that period between the leaders. But okay, for Carter, the domestic revival, domestic confidence was more important than the Soviet-American relations, and that we can understand why. So let me now turn to what happened later. In the in the late 80s, or some will say in the early 90s, the Cold War ended. Well, it ended probably when Gorbachev came to power, or when Gorbachev and Reagan met, or Gorbachev and Bush signed, George Bush, the elder, signed a joint statement that the Cold War is over. Or maybe when the Berlin Wall collapsed or the East European countries developed their independence from the Soviet Union, or maybe when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Well, all of that was in a relatively short period of time, within 2 or 3 years. And we know that, well, there is no more foreign danger, but also there was no more to compete with, neither in Russia nor in the United States. Okay, Russia competed, or Russia struggled during the 90s with its domestic turmoil. Russia struggled with economic hardship of the reforms, with the political reforms, while the United States initially in the 90s were triumphant. And, you know, the American, if you look back on what Bill Clinton was speaking about, or about the economic numbers of the 90s, it looked like the United States was on the top of its success. But then within probably a first decade, after the first decade of that, it looked like the American society started to, well, to radicalize and to split. There was several examples, I would say, several parts of this split. First, if you look into Republicans and Democrats, starting from the middle of the 90s already, the two major American political parties were less and less agreed to each other. I mean, there are, if you look into the voting in Congress, you will see that prior to the middle of the 90s, there were a significant portion of the legislation that both countries agreed to vote for. Starting from the middle of the 90s, the less and less legislation was agreed by the both parties. They were either supported by one party and rejected by the other, or vice versa. And the split became more and more radical during this quarter of century, starting the late 90s until the recent events, well, till, I would say, President Donald Trump and all the turmoils at this last 4 years. And that was an important change, important radicalization of the American political landscape. At the same time, you can see that some of the political ideas, or even language, some of the language of the politicians, which would be impossible to imagine back during the Cold War, became accepted in the American society. Well, Bernie Sanders was easy to use the word socialism, which used to be the swear words in the American political system. Socialism was un-American. Well, Bernie Sanders embraced the word, embraced the idea, and it did not actually alienated him as a political figure. He's still influential figure, so nobody anymore afraid of socialists, because there is no big socialist rival which want to destroy destroy the United States. Russia itself, even now, when the Russia emerged as a kind of threat to the United States, Russia is no more socialist. In Russia, if you look in the mirror image, we see that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, all the concepts of democracy, liberal political order was also embraced. Something which was considered a threat back in the 70s, in the 90s became the standard way of speaking about the political system. So we have liberalism, democracy everywhere. And even President Putin continued to speak about democracy with some of the reservations, but still it became an important part of the domestic language in contemporary Russia. But Russian political landscape also became more and more split, starting with probably the end of the first decade of this century. It started later than in the United States, just because well, it was a time when the Russians finally found themselves survivors of the 90s, survivors of the political and economic reforms, and started to think and to behave politically. And they immediately found themselves in the situation of the split between those, well, in the Russian language, it would be pro-Putin and anti-Putin forces, but it also can be described as a more authoritarian and more liberal forces, or, well, you can find a different language for describing the Russian split. But I would say that as soon as the split became visible, it was, I would say it was 2011 or 2012. It was a year when Vladimir Putin decided to return to the post of president after Dmitry Medvedev interregnum, Dmitry Medvedev being president for 4 years. And it actually led to the mass protest in the streets, especially in Moscow. And if you look at the Russian propaganda of that time, that the first idea that the Russian propaganda used was that, okay, those people who protested against Putin or against the rigged elections were the people who are somehow connected with the United States. They were American powers. And that was actually was a reinvention of the Cold War ideas and the Cold War mentality, I would say. That was not, well, I do not believe that the politicians themselves, or at least those who are decision makers themselves, believes in this type of causation. But that was a very easy idea. If you need to alienate a domestic rival or domestic political opposition, you should connect this opposition to the major rival abroad. And for Russia, again, the major rival abroad, or the major threat abroad, or menace abroad, was and still is the United States. So the propaganda for the last 10 years is using this way to fight an opposition. The Russian authorities invented labels of foreign agent, and that labeled the NGOs, independent NGOs, as foreign agent. Recently, they became to label foreign agent the mass media and even physical people, the persons, the people. Well, we have just few people who are labeled foreign agent. And that means foreign agent, everybody understood, they are labeled as an agent of the United States. It's nothing to do with the truth of the facts. Nobody, or at least as far as I know, no organizations actually is an agent of the foreign country. But this is a way how the state wants to use to reinvent this Cold War opposition in order to keep control over domestic development, domestic case. On the American side, I was surprised to see how American Democratic press used the same trick when attacking President Donald Trump. Well, I do not personally support, I am a foreign person. I do not like Donald Trump appearance maybe, but when I read what American Democratic media was publishing about Donald Trump, about his connections with Russia, well, it looked very similar to how Russian authorities tried to alienate anti-Putin opposition. It looked like, you know, if you don't like Donald Trump and you don't believe that Donald Trump was an American, it looks like you should, well, the Democratic press wanted to label Donald Trump as un-American, probably the Russian power. And everything which Democratic press did not like in Trump's policies was labeled like a result of the Russian meddling, of Russian interference. I do not know if Putin or Russian secret services interfered into American elections, but I do know that American media use of this Russian meddling in the domestic political struggle was very similar to what Russian authorities were doing towards the Russian opposition. So that is also the reinvention of the Cold War ideas. You need the significant other, you need the important foreign threat to be able to mobilize your own supporters domestically and to make the opposition look alien, look un-American in American case, or look like foreign or probably pro-American in the Russian case. So that was an important return to the Cold War. Well, there is a number of books already published in the United States and in Russia with the titles like Return of Cold War, New Cold War. Well, there is no Cold War in which we lived through in the last years in anything but in the rhetoric. But this is very important because, well, there is something in Cold War which makes politicians, you know, makes politicians comfortable in dealing with new threats, new challenges. And the very last thing I want to say before we're going to get to Q&A, the other side. I have mentioned that the Cold War actually forced, well, was a big incentive to improve your own society, our own society, American own society, and some of the big domestic reforms was made, well, if not totally because of the foreign concerns, but with well, having this factor in mind. And if you look into American or Russian development in the recent decades, or a couple of decades, I would say, since new millennium, you would find very, well, you can argue, you can say that I'm wrong, but it looks like the absence of the need of the competition makes a lot of, well, activities of domestic governments less targeted into home improvement. Well, let's hope that President Biden, who started recently, announced this big strategic plan of improvement will make a difference. But until recently, we don't see that American government did do anything with the home improvement. Well, there was an attempts, I don't know, Obamacare was a home improvement, but it's, well, not everybody were happy about that. In Russia, well, it was no home improvement as a way to demonstrate the Russian leadership in the world. The only propaganda invention that Mr. Putin used was that Russia was the leader of the so-called traditional values countries, which is not, it's something opposite to the idea of being the beacon of the humankind, of leading the humankind forward, because being a traditional value country means that you are actually lagging behind. You are not leading the humankind forward. So that was an important difference between the Cold War time and the contemporary period. There is a big difference between the period of international competition and trying to improve domestically, and the period of triumphant presentism. You know, the presentism on a time when nobody are concerned about the future, everybody are concerned about only the present day. And well, if not Elon Musk, I would say that even the space competition would be forgotten. But well, maybe this new technological challenge will revive, not the Cold War, but revive the humankind strive for the better future, for something beyond the present day concerns. But again, I would say that the Cold War, we can look at the Cold War not only as a period of the geopolitical or military competition or even the ideological struggle. The Cold War was also the period when the globe was divided between two camps. In each camps tried to develop its own society, to develop its own science, and to become better, because it was a competition. And you know, without a competition, if we use this sports metaphor in the politics all the way, well, without competition, nobody will run marathon, you know, in the shorter time. Nobody will do better. And that is, well, I would say the positive side of the international competition and the positive side of the Cold War. That is why some of the politicians, and I can guess many of the contemporary politicians, feel nostalgic for the Cold War times. And this is what we see in the contemporary politics. Thank you. I will stop here and we'll be ready for Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much for such an interesting presentation that really covered a lot of ground from the early Cold War and its sort of various forms, from cultural, economic, political, artistic competition to the present. And I do want to encourage people, if they have questions, to write them in the chat or use the Q&A function. I see a couple of questions have come in. While we just wait for a few more to accumulate, I wanted to ask about your last point, which you concluded with. I find myself agreeing with you that there were some positive elements to this competition, at least from my perspective. You know, the expansion of welfare state benefits in Western Europe and the US as a result of the economic competition between capitalism and Soviet socialism, expansion of educational opportunities, which you mentioned, civil rights movement, which you mentioned. And then this stands in sharp contrast to the post-Soviet neo-Cold War, if you'd like to call it that, or rhetorical Cold War, where there don't really seem to be any tangible benefits beyond, you know, those accruing to political leaders who want to suppress domestic dissent, or news organizations that want to, you know, sell newspapers or online advertising space. And so I'm wondering, why do you think it is that this competition is kind of in some ways hollowed out or turned into something that doesn't lead to meaningful domestic reform? Is it because there's no longer a real difference in economic system, in the sense that they're both capitalist countries that are, you know, have their own varieties of capitalism, but are also interconnected economically? Is it because this is really a rhetorical, nostalgic contest, or is there another reason that you think?
Mm-hmm. Okay, Eric, sorry, can you repeat the very last part of your question?
Sure. I was just asking, the question was why do you think this competition has changed to one that really doesn't lead to meaningful domestic reform? And is it about the absence of real economic difference in terms of the type of system, or about the shift to a more nostalgic rhetorical contest rather than a more robust contest in a variety of areas?
Well, I would say that there is no more, well, what we have now, it's not a competition in terms it used to be during the Cold War. It is not a competition for the, you know, hearts and minds of the humankind. This is more of the geopolitics, but well, in some territories, like, you know, Syria or maybe Ukraine, maybe, but not the world, not the global scale. And this is more of the rhetorical use of the the use of the same set of references to achieve domestic benefits, but not to achieve worldwide recognition, which was an important part of the Cold War. The worldwide recognition, worldwide support was an important part then, and it is not anymore so. And Russia today is not, as I've mentioned, Russia today is not does not portray itself as a model for the rest of humankind. So there is no more the competition in this form. That is why we don't have the same influence of the same inclination to improve themselves, improve ourselves, I would say, to improve, to make Russia more attractive. Why? What for? I would say, Russia does not want to be more attractive, to be better, to look better. Well, it's enough. The only important story was to make Russia look like a pole in the international, I could say, bipolar or maybe tripolar system. And that is something that Putin did achieve, had achieved. That Russia looked as at least like a military challenger or something, to military challenger to the Western world order. And this is sufficient for some countries to support Russia, because, not nobody, but many countries and many leaders in the world do not like the unipolar system. So some second pole should emerge, and if not China, that Russia maybe one of these poles. China still behave more cautiously, while its economic strength is much bigger now than the Russian one. But militarily, politically, China is much more constrained than Russia, as you can see. So Russia is still behave as a opposite pole to the United States.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think, I think maybe both the US and Russia, there's nostalgia in both for a bipolar world when really we have a multipolar one. There's some questions that have come in from Michael Thomas in the Q&A. He is asking there's a question about, is there a future for manned spaceflight cooperation? And then he's curious about, this Korean airliner episode of the 1980s. Would the Russian Air Force pilot obey an order to shoot down a civilian airliner?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I hope that there is a future for space cooperation, but I would say that we recently heard something opposite, that the Russian space agency announced that it will build another, the future of the Russian space project will be independent from the International Space Station. And that means that the Soviet Space Agency announced that Russia will develop the future manned space programs without, after the International Space Station will be outdated, will retire. Russia will do it without Americans and maybe without Europeans, and maybe with Chinese. We don't know yet. I'm not sure about that. But at the same time, so that's a bad sign, I would say, to the joint space, to the cooperation in space. On the other hand, I would say that the space programs are something of the long-lasting programs, and this is something which is developed for decades. It was not something we can do tomorrow, and I would dare to say that within 10 years the whole international system will change, and I hope that Russian political system will change within these 10 years. And it means that many of the programs which are abandoned right now, including the space cooperation program, will be either resumed or revived, or will get another chance. So I do not believe that the contemporary will just yesterday announcement of Mr. Rogozin, the head of the Russian Space Agency, will be in force 10 years from now, that I would say. But yes, if we judge just for year 2021, everything looks not promising. well, but I am an historical optimist. I would say that in 10 years it will all change. And as for the pilot and the Korean liner, I hope it will not, because, well, even in the Russian military, as far as I understand, people now are less, I would say, less, well, more contemplative, I would say. The people had more options in more understanding of what is going on than to just to fulfill fulfill orders. So if there is a direct order to, in such a case, it would not be well for. I would say that there are different pilots, of course. I cannot say for them, but I'm sure that there is a difference between 1983 and the year 2021 in the way the military pilots are thinking about their task, about their the challenges. But I would not rule out the possibility of the mistakes, of errors, and there is something that I believe happened in Ukraine in 2015. Despite the fact that the Russian government did not recognize it, my understanding that it was a tragic error. Well, nobody wanted to shut down the airplane, the passenger airplane, but that was a tragic error by somebody, probably by military, But this is something we could not rule out. That happened in the military zones. It happened with American military as well, not only with Russian military. It happened in the Persian Gulf, if you look up in the stories.
Great, yeah, that's absolutely true. And it's also worth remembering too, and also in 1983, there was the famous case of Stanislav Petrov, who had a signal indicating a nuclear strike was imminent and actually refused orders to launch a strike. So it's really, I mean, it sort of comes down to individual decisions, and it's hard to predict based upon nationality or ideology, but it becomes a very human response. We have another question here coming in. It looks like Bob Swan has entered the Q&A. Bob, if you have a question, feel free to type it in. Bob Swan was very involved in exchanges between the Soviet Union and Russia in the 1980s and continues to be involved in US-Russian relations. I was wondering, in the meantime, Ivan, while we have a little more time, if you could talk a little bit about public attitudes in both countries, because we can sort of see how politicians are using this cynically, and we can see how news organizations are using this to sell newspapers. But I'm wondering how you see public attitudes in Russia about the United States and in the United States about Russia.
Well, I would say they are not quite good, unfortunately, because as somebody who studied Russian-American relations, I would just postulate that the attitudes, mutual attitudes, are not maybe not in the worst point in its history, but in one of the worst points. And I would say that there are several factors which influenced, and of course, first of all, it's politics of Mr. Putin, and some of the, I would say, politics of the American government. I would not want to equal to say that both sides are equally responsible. No, I would say, as a Russian, I would say that Russian government is more responsible for the bad relations, but still there are, I could not say that American presidents or American Congress was always contemplative in postulating Russian policies, and not always. Well, that was the part of responsibility on the American side as well. But if you when we speak about the public attitudes, they're influenced not only by the politicians, and sometimes it's vice versa. The political decisions are influenced by the public attitudes, and the public attitudes had a long legacy of the use of the other in America as use of Russia, and the Russia use of the United States as a threat, as a significant other, constitutive other, even as in constructivist theory. So something which will produce a threat, produce a menace, or challenge at least to your own survival, to your existential being, and that is why. And that is why the public attitudes are still not quite good. Just if I can, just a small story about the public attitudes. There is a Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which is doing the the polls in the United States about Americans' attitude to foreign countries. And they also included of course, the American attitudes to Russia. And they have a different type of polls. And I've seen that poll which distinguish the attitudes to Russia based on the democratic or Republican leaning of the audience, of the respondents. And if you look at this attitudes to Russia like I would say, pro-democratic or pro-republican public for the period of the last 2 decades, you would see that, well, during most of the period, they are almost coincided. I mean, American Republicans and American Democrats were looking into Russia, almost the same way. During crisis, the attitudes going lower. During the summits or better relations, it go up, as usually the news influence the attitudes. But there were several examples when Democratic public and Republican respondents were different in attitudes to Russia. And that was during Barack Obama. First it was during George W. Bush and Putin summits. And, when George Bush said that he looked into Putin's eyes and found soul there, that was famous story. The second time was when President Barack Obama met President Medvedev, and, this new the reset between two countries started. And the third one was during the early Trump presidency. And what we see, when Republican President Bush met Putin, the attitudes of Republicans to Russia was significantly better than Democratic attitudes to Russia. When Barack Obama met President Medvedev, the Democratic attitudes to Russia was significantly better than Republican attitudes. And again, when President Trump became president, of course, Republican attitudes to Russia again was better than the Democratic attitudes. So we can conclude that when American president want to improve, at least even slightly improve the relations of the United States with Russia, the representatives of the opposite party started to criticize him. And that was what happened in each of the periods. And it means that the American public opinion about Russia was generally not quite positive. It is easy to criticize American president for trying to make deals or better relations with Russia. It's easy target. It's a low hanging fruit to criticize everybody. So that is not a good news for the future of Russian-American relations, but this is how Americans attitude. And if you look into Russia, it's even more easy. It's even easier. In Russia, this liberal critics of President Putin more or less consider it to be like pro-American, even if they don't. I mean, that's like a common sense that everybody who are against Putin probably wants better relations with America. And even if it's not true in some concrete and some personal cases, it is like a general opinion. And those who are pro-Putin are anti-American. And it's easy how to judge. Sorry for a long response to
No, that's I think, I think it really boils down to, it ends up being more about domestic politics than about whatever is happening in the other country
Yes.
necessarily. We have a couple of questions that have come in. Bob Swan, as I mentioned, of the International Peace Center here in Lawrence, asks, what are the prospects for citizen diplomacy initiatives between Russia and American citizens, such as the anniversary meetings on the Elbe River? Are there Russian citizen groups still actively engaging with American citizens?
Well, as far as I heard, there is some celebrations where these days actually. I was last week. It was a last minute invitation. I was invited to speak to some online meeting, and I need to. I was forced to refuse because it's because of the schedule conflict. It was last minute invitation, but because of that invitation, I know that this at least online meeting did happen this year. Well, there is. Well, I know there are several groups in the United States devoted to this celebration, and the Elbe River meetings still stands as one of the biggest, I would say, metaphors of the possibility of Russian-American cooperation, of the importance of the Russian-American rapprochement, and that is why it's important. There are people in Russia who participate in that, who wants to participate in that, while in Russia the civil groups are more and more restricted by the state, and it's hard. It's became harder to support this civic initiative, citizen initiative, but it's still possible. It's harder than it used to be, but we are not yet back to the Soviet Union. So that means that people, well, if not pandemic, people can travel, and I hope it will be resumed travels maybe this year, before the end of this year, and the people still can communicate, and people still can express their feelings and their attitudes. In some cases, you can see that Russians feel it important to participate in the remembrance of the Elbe River, because many Russians believe that Americans do not, that Americans underestimate the Russian sacrifice in the Second World War. You know, that is widely believed in Russia, that Americans do not know that Russians lost 27, well, the Soviet people lost 27 million dead during the war, that the Red Army, suffered the hugest, I would say, paid the hugest price in blood for fighting Nazism. And that is why many Russians want to, say, explain to Americans during the Elbe River that Russians was an important ally, and that probably that Russians won the victory over Nazis. And that is why many Russians were offended a year ago when it was I would say, tweet, either by President Trump or by White House official tweet, when he celebrated the American and British victory in the war, without mentioning Russia. And of course, Russian propaganda used it widely, but it was an original tweet, and the people felt, okay, they wanted to forget that we lost so many people. Like almost every family lost somebody during the war. That is why the Second World War, is still so important in Russia. That is why Mr. Putin tries to use the memory of the war, or his defense of the sacred memory of the victims of the war, as a quasi-ideology in Russia. It's probably hard to imagine in the United States because, well, the Elbe River is an important part of history, but it's history. In Russia, it's not only history, it's almost contemporary ideology, the sacred memory of the war. That is why, of course, people do remember of Elbe River. And again, this also may be played as an argument in saying that we were on the same side with Americans in the greatest battle, in the hugest war that Russia did suffer in its history. The Russia, the Soviet Union, was on the same side with the United States. We are not adversaries, we're not enemies. We are fighting together against Nazism. And this is important. This is important for those in Russia who wants to improve Russian-American relations. It's one of the arguments. It's still very important. Well, it's still resonating in Russia exactly because the war memory is so important.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from my colleague, Professor Yves Levin in the history department, who's asking about embracing traditional values as inherently backward-looking rather than forward-looking. And she remarks that there seems to be a competition of sorts between Russia and US Republicans to claim world leadership and upholding quote-unquote traditional values, defined as mainly limiting LGBTQ and anti-feminist values. And so do you see this as media posturing or a competition or perhaps even a partnership? Because it is, it is certainly a global movement of sorts, and it's one that actually extends beyond just Russia and the US. So is this, if you could maybe say a bit about this new trend?
Yes, this is a very good question because, Russian politicians, and I would say that majority of Russian public usually understands Republicans better than they understand Democrats. I would say, well, if I look around and I see my colleagues and professors, okay, many of them, probably majority of them are more pro-democratic, but the general public are much more pro-republican because they are, well, I would not share the values, but they understand the values of Republicans, of American republics. And in this way, certainly in this way, Russia is, let's say, more traditional or less liberal than the United States right now. But the whole situation is more complex because it's not just, there many Russians, again, I cannot say for all Russians when I speak about that, but many Russians who are, I would say, pro-Republican, at the same time are not Republican in its core, because there is a big legacy of anti-Soviet thinking. And some people do think that American Democratic Party reminds them the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And in some, I would say it is some true in that, not in terms that the Democrats are the communists or something like that, but some of the news of the, well, especially this, I would say, at least as described in the media. Of course, it may be wrong, but it's at least the new development in American, with American political correctness, with American, well, especially things like deplatforming of undesirable people, look very much like, well, for some Russians, look very much like a very Soviet practice. And the Soviet liberal and post-Soviet liberals in Russia also feels, I would say, liberals, those who are for freedoms, do think that the political correctness is not about freedom, it's something opposite to freedom. And that is why they understand the Republican attitudes to political correctness, to democratic agenda. It's not so much about LGBTQ or about the feminism. It's about this type of restrictions or speech restrictions. Well, you can joke about everybody. You should not think about being offensive. Well, it's the problem of those who are offended. It's not the problem of those. That is a very widespread idea in Russia. Well, it reminds probably the core Republican audience in the United States. But well, during Trump presidency, the United States suddenly look more familiar to Russians, I would say. Before Trump, everybody in Russia looking in the United States would say that, well, the United States is another like alien planet. It's extraterrestrial. I mean, we do not understand what is going on with these democratic restrictions or democratic requirements to being polite, because it's too much for us. But when Trump came to power, when Russians learned about the existence of this almost half of Americans who supported Trump, okay, we see that America is much more looks like core Russia, I would say. And that is, well, everything what I just said is not about the Russian intellectuals, but since straight who better understand everything. But I would say about the more general public, including educated public, but well, like engineers, school teachers, and well, even journalists who are more and more, well, who feels this so-called campus culture or cancel culture, I say. They're afraid of cancel culture to come to Russia. And this is something which makes them closer to Republicans. Again, this is not exactly that there is a partnership. It's something resembling the agendas of Republicans. Again, sorry for long, for talkative response.
No, thank you for that. I think it's a really interesting. It's almost a paradoxical situation, right, where you have these two groups that were often, Republicans often being the most hawkish and aggressive in foreign policy, somehow seeing eye to eye. So I think that's actually that on that paradox, it's a good way to end things. I do want to note before we conclude to Michael Thomas's question, there are still official delegations that can happen, and travel is certainly right now is difficult, but in normal times is very, very possible to go back and forth between these countries. Bob Swan wants us to note that on Wednesday, May 19th at 7 p.m., the International Peace Center and the William J. Perry Project will sponsor a Zoom webinar on reducing the threat of nuclear catastrophe based on the Perry and Kalina book, The Button. So I encourage you to attend that. And I thank you to all of you for attending our series this spring, and I hope to see all of you hopefully in person in the fall. But a big thanks to Professor Ivan Kurilla for this wonderful talk today, which was I think a great way to conclude things. And I really encourage you to follow his publications, which come out not only in Russian but also in English. He's one of the commentators on U.S.-Russian relations in terms of history and contemporary issues that I often go to and follow myself. So I encourage all of you to follow his work. And thank you so much, Ivan, for your talk today.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, and thank everybody who asked questions, and thank you for very, very interesting, stimulating questions. I'd say I should answer that there is I think there are official delegations which can be revived. I do not see it as a already existing thing, but well, I see that there is a special agency in Russia now called the Россотрудничество, a Russian agency for international cooperation, which can produce. But this is not a Soviet Union. It's hard to do it the same way it was there. Again, thank you very much. Thank you for organizing. Thank you for joining. Hope let's part with a hope for the better future for Russian-American relations.
Yes, I hope so, and hope to see you again soon in person. And thank you all for coming. Thanks to Justina Banik for helping organize this series, and hope to see you all again soon.
Okay, thank you.